It's really incredible how you can feel like a slightly or sometimes even dramatically different person depending on who you're with.
Absolutely.
Think about a student you might know. Maybe they're the quietest person in your classroom, raising their hand tentatively, speaking softly, following every rule precisely.
Mm-hmm.
But then you see them outside with their best friend during recess, and suddenly they're loud, boisterous, maybe even pushing boundaries you didn't think they were capable of.
Yeah, that shift is so common.
Or perhaps you notice it in yourself. The way you interact with your family might be completely different from how you are with your romantic partner, or how you present yourselves to colleagues or mentors.
Right.
It's more than just adapting your behavior for the situation, isn't it?
It really is.
It feels like different parts of your very identity come to the surface, influenced by the person or people you're with.
Exactly. That feeling points to something really fundamental about human identity, that who we are isn't just this single fixed thing. A huge part of our sense of self is deeply intertwined with and actually shaped by our relationships with the important people in our lives.
So these connections aren't just external things.
Not at all. They actually internalize and become part of our psychological makeup.
And that brings us right into our deep dive for today, the relational self.
Mm.
We're going to explore this concept that aspects of who you are, your identity, your thoughts, feelings, goals, even your behaviors, are specifically linked to your relationships with important people. Your family, close friends, partners, maybe even impactful teachers or mentors you've had.
And to guide us through this really fascinating area, we're drawing exclusively from the insights presented in a specific chapter from a handbook on identity theory and research.
Okay.
This work comes from experts Serena Chen, Helen Boucher, and Michael W. Krauss. So everything we discuss today is based only on their research and perspectives as they laid them out in this particular chapter.
Got it. So Chen, Boucher, and Krauss are our guides. Our mission, then, in this deep dive, is to really unpack this complex idea. What does it actually mean to have a self that's defined by relationships?
Right.
What are the core theories? And what's the evidence behind it? And maybe especially for you listening, with your background in elementary education and that interest in psychology, what does this understanding offer? How does it help make sense to the students in your classroom?
Yeah, how do these different relational selves actually show up in their interactions, their emotions, their goals, their actions?
Exactly. And how can recognizing this whole dynamic process give us maybe valuable tools for navigating and supporting the really intricate social and emotional world of young learners?
Well, it's definitely an opportunity to gain a deeper understanding of those shifts in identity that you observe and, frankly, experience yourself. Recognizing someone's relational selves can unlock some really crucial insights into their behavior, their feelings, even their potential, actually, within different relational contexts.
So it moves beyond just seeing behavior as a simple trait.
Absolutely. It helps us understand behavior as something potentially triggered by the underlying relational dynamics.
Okay, let's really dig into this idea then, the relational self. Where do we start?
Well, at its core, the relational self isn't just about the fact that you have relationships or that you're influenced by them. It's really about who you are specifically within those relationships.
Okay.
The authors use a key phrase to emphasize this. They see it as a self within relationships.
A self within relationships.
Yeah.
That phrasing feels important. It sounds like it puts the focus squarely on the dynamic, right? The interaction, the unique way you are when you're engaged with that specific other person.
Precisely. It's not just about absorbing parts of them into your general personality. And this is a really fundamental distinction the authors make. They contrast their self-within relationships view with some other perspectives, which they might frame more as relationships within the self.
Okay, what's the difference there?
That latter view, relationships within the self, is often more about how you incorporate aspects of others, maybe their traits, their perspectives, even their resources, into your overall kind of enduring sense of who you are.
Like taking on their interests or values as your own.
Exactly. But the relational self, as Chen, Boucher, and Krauss define it, is really zeroed in on your specific configuration of being, thinking, and feeling when you are in the context of relating to a particular significant other.
Got it. So it's not about, say, a student adopting their parents' love of history as part of their overall identity.
Right.
It's more about who that student is and how they feel and act when they're actually discussing history with that specific parent. Maybe they become really curious, ask tons of questions. Maybe they feel this calm sense of connection, or maybe they're really eager to impress that parent. It's the dynamic itself.
Exactly. It's the dynamic self that emerges in relation to that specific other person. And to build this picture, the authors draw on some earlier work, specifically from Chen, Boucher, and Tapias back in 2006, laying out 4 core assumptions that really underpin this view of the relational self.
4 foundational pillars. Okay, let's break them down. What's the first one?
The first assumption is all about linked knowledge. The main idea here is that in your memory, you store knowledge about yourself specifically as you exist when you are relating to a particular significant other.
Okay.
And this specific self-knowledge is interconnected or linked in your memory with the knowledge you have about that significant other themselves.
Okay, so if I picture my memory like a big filing cabinet,
Hmm.
it's not just one folder labeled me. It's like I have folders for me with mom, me with my best friend, me with my boss.
That's a really helpful way to think about it. And inside that Me with Mom folder, you'd find descriptions like, maybe I tend to be quiet around my mother, or I often seek her approval. Now, here's the absolutely crucial part, and it builds on that distinction we just talked about. This self-knowledge in the relational self folder, like I am submissive around my mother, is stored distinctly from the knowledge you have about your mother as a person. For instance, my mother is assertive, or my mother isn't submissive.
Ah, okay, that's key.
It really is. Your relational self with someone is not just a mirror image or an absorption of their traits.
So even if my mother is, say, a very outspoken person, myself with mom might be characterized by being more reserved, because that's my typical way of relating within that specific dynamic.
Precisely. It's about the interplay, not just you becoming like them.
Okay.
This distinction is vital. It really reinforces that self within relationships idea. It highlights that the relational self is about your unique way of being with them, shaped by that dynamic, not just you internalizing their characteristics into your general context-free self.
That makes a lot more sense. It really clarifies what they mean. Okay, what's the second assumption?
Assumption number 2 concerns multiple levels of specificity. The authors propose that these relational selves aren't just stored at the level of individual relationships. They actually exist at different levels of abstraction, like organizing those folders in your filing cabinet in different ways.
Different levels. Okay, tell me more.
So there's the most granular level, the relationship-specific self. This is the self you are when you're relating to one particular individual, the self with your partner, the self with your younger sibling, the self with that one really inspiring teacher you had back in elementary school.
Okay, the me with Mrs. Davison, my 5th grade teacher folder. Very specific.
Exactly. Then there's the generalized level. This is more like a summary or an abstraction across a category of similar relationships.
Right.
Well, for example, the self you tend to be with family members in general, or the self you are with colleagues at work, or maybe the self you adopt with people you see as authority figures. It captures the common patterns that emerge from your interactions across a group of similar others.
So maybe a me with teachers folder that summarizes common themes from interacting with lots of teachers, but that's still different from the specific me with Mrs. Davison folder, which has all the unique details.
Precisely. It's an abstraction of the common threads. And then finally, there's the most global level. This refers to your conceptions of yourself in relation to significant others as a whole group, a very broad sense of who you are in the overall context of important relationships in your life.
Okay, so individual person,
Yeah.
then categories of people, then significant others broadly. And I imagine the specific characteristics and patterns within each of these levels could be wildly different.
Oh, absolutely. How you are with your family might be completely different from how you are with your colleagues. And even within your family, how you are with your mom could be quite different from how you are with your sister.
Right.
And this layered structure is super relevant for understanding the dynamics you see every day in an elementary classroom, right? Think about a child. They almost certainly have a distinct relational self with you, their classroom teacher, compared to the art teacher or the school librarian or the principal. And they definitely have different relational selves with different peers. Maybe they're quiet and compliant with one group, but assertive or even kind of bossy with another.
That's so true. And beyond those specific relationships, they might develop a generalized relational self for teachers in general, maybe based on their experiences across different grades, or even just what they hear about teachers.
Exactly. Or a generalized self for adults at school or kids my age.
Yeah.
And how a child behaves in any given moment or how they feel about themselves right then can be powerfully influenced by which specific or generalized relational self is currently active, currently online.
So their behavior isn't just some fixed trait like shy or outgoing?
Not necessarily. It's often a manifestation of the relational self that's been triggered by that specific context.
That really helps explain why a child might seem like a totally different person in math class compared to gym class, or why they act one way during whole group instruction and another way during free play with their friends.
Exactly. It gives us a framework for understanding that kind of variability.
Okay, the third assumption. How do these different relational selves, these different folders in the cabinet, actually get opened? How do they become active in our working self concept?
Right. Assumption 3 is all about activation. This ties directly into that idea of the working self concept,
Hunches.
which is basically the subset of your total self-knowledge that's currently accessible and influencing your thoughts, feelings, and behavior right now. Your relational selves, like all self-knowledge, aren't always active. They need to be brought online, so to speak.
So myself with my buddy, who makes me laugh hysterically, isn't usually part of my working self concept when I'm, say, trying to negotiate a tricky contract at work.
Exactly. Unless maybe the person you're negotiating with reminds you of that buddy.
Okay.
Relational selves get activated and temporarily become part of that working self-concept, shaping your present experience. And this activation can happen in a couple of main ways. First, there's contextual activation, meaning cues in the immediate environment trigger the relevant relational self. The most obvious cue is the actual presence of the significant other.
Right.
But it can also be something that just reminds you of them, imagining them, seeing a photo, visiting a place you associate with them, or even just encountering interaction dynamics that are typical of that relationship.
Like getting a text message from your sister, or facing a problem where you'd normally ask a specific mentor for advice.
Exactly. Those are contextual cues. The environment provides a trigger, and that trigger pulls up the corresponding relational self file or folder.
Okay. And the other way.
The other way is chronic activation. If you repeatedly activate a particular relational self contextually, maybe because you interact with that person very frequently, or the relationship is just really central or emotionally intense for you, that relational self becomes more chronically accessible.
Like it's easier to get to.
Yeah, it's stored closer to the surface of your memory, metaphorically speaking. It's more likely to be activated even without really strong or explicit immediate cues, like a well-worn path in your mind.
Like a frequently used bookmark in that mental library. It's just easier to flip to that section.
That's a great analogy. Why this matters is fundamental. It explains when these different, sometimes seemingly contradictory aspects of your relational self show up and influence your experience and behavior. It's not random, it's often predictable based on the cues in the situation and the chronic accessibility of certain relational selves.
This is incredibly relevant for the classroom. Just seeing their teacher walk into the room or hearing their name called or being put into a specific group for an activity.
Absolutely. Those can all contextually activate a student's self with teacher or self with that peer group relational self.
Right.
And for a student who has a particularly strong relationship dynamic with a teacher, positive or negative, that specific self with teacher might become more chronically accessible, meaning it could influence their behavior even when they aren't directly interacting with that teacher. Just being in that classroom, a place strongly associated with that teacher, might be enough of a trigger. It could shape their general confidence or anxiety level or willingness to participate while they're simply in that physical space.
Wow. The room itself becomes a cue. That's powerful. Okay, finally, the fourth assumption. What's actually in these relational self-representations? What kind of information is stored?
The fourth assumption details the content of relational selves. What are these folders or files actually storing about the self in relation to others?
Yeah.
And it's much more than just a list of adjectives.
So it's not just, I'm funny with my friends.
Right, that's part of it, but it's much broader and deeper. The content includes self-conceptions, how you see yourself in that specific relationship. This does include attribute-based descriptions like I'm funny with them, or I'm serious with my mentor, or maybe I feel awkward around my partner. It also includes role-based conceptions, like seeing yourself as the helper in one relationship or the authority figure in another, or maybe the one who needs support in a third. These self-conceptions are shaped by the unique history of experiences within that relationship and also by broader cultural norms about roles.
Okay, so how I define myself specifically in that pairing.
Yes, but crucially, it goes significantly beyond just those definitions. Relational selves also encompass affective material.
Meaning feelings.
Exactly. The typical feelings and emotional states you experience when you're with that person. Do you tend to feel calm or anxious, joyful, irritated, secure, inadequate? Those feelings are baked into the relational self.
Okay.
They also include goals and motives.
Uh-huh.
What are you trying to achieve, or what fundamentally drives you in that specific relationship? Are you motivated to seek closeness, maintain distance, gain approval, avoid conflict, help the other person succeed?
And you mentioned self-regulatory strategies too, how we manage ourselves.
Exactly. The ways you regulate your own thoughts, emotions, and behaviors to navigate that specific relationship are part of the relational self. Do you tend to suppress your feelings, choose your words carefully, try to anticipate their reactions, use specific coping mechanism?
Uh-huh.
And finally, they include behavioral tendencies, the specific actions and patterns of behavior you tend to exhibit towards that significant other.
Wow. So it's a whole package deal. How you see yourself, how you feel, what you want, how you manage yourself, and how you tend to act, all linked to that specific relationship.
It really is. Think about the example they sometimes use. A relational self developed with a very critical parent. It might include conceiving of yourself as somehow flawed or inferior,
Right.
feeling a chronic sense of anxiety or rejection when interacting with them, having the primary goal to somehow please them or at least avoid their criticism, and maybe employing self-regulatory strategies like being overly cautious or withdrawn in their presence.
So it's not just a simple description. It's like a whole profile of your psychological experience in that specific dynamic.
Yeah, exactly. And this really demonstrates the breadth and depth of the relational self. It actively shapes how you think, feel, want, regulate yourself, and act whenever that specific relational self is active.
Okay, let me try to recap this first section then. The author's view is that the relational self is this distinct part of our identity, made up of aspects of ourselves specifically tied to relationships with significant others.
Right.
This knowledge is stored in memory. It's linked to our idea of the significant other, but it's importantly distinct from it.
Crucially distinct, yes.
These relationals exist at multiple levels: specific people, generalized categories, and globally. They get activated by cues in the context and can become chronically accessible.
Yeah.
And the content is really rich: self-conceptions, emotions, goals, self-regulation, strategies, behaviors, the whole shebang.
You've got it. That gives us a really solid understanding of what the relational self is, according to this model. It sets the stage for understanding how it works.
Okay, so we understand what it is, how it's structured in memory, and that it can be activated. But what's the primary mechanism? What's the engine, so to speak, that brings these specific relationship-linked selves online? Not just when we're with the original person, but maybe even more surprisingly, when we encounter new people. The authors draw heavily on one specific concept here, don't they?
They do, and it's the concept of transference.
Transference. Okay, I think a lot of people might recognize that term, maybe from psychotherapy, where it talks about a client transferring feelings from an old relationship onto their therapist. Is that the idea here?
Well, that clinical origin, tracing back to Freud, is definitely where the term comes from. But Chen, Boucher, and Krauss, and the researchers they build upon, particularly Susan Anderson and her colleagues, are really focused on the social cognitive model of transference.
Okay, social cognitive. How's that different?
This model takes that core idea that patterns from past significant relationships resurface and applies it much more broadly to everyday social interactions. It describes how aspects of past relationships, including both the representation of the significant other and the linked relational self, can become active when you encounter new people in your daily life.
So it's not just something that happens on the therapist's couch, but something that happens automatically, maybe even outside our awareness, as we just go about our day.
Precisely. The social cognitive model assumes that, based on all our experiences, we form these really detailed mental representations of our significant others. Think of them like rich profiles stored in memory.
Yeah.
They contain not just attributes like my mom is warm, but also beliefs about their internal states. My mom worries a lot, the feelings associated with them. I feel secure around my mom, and even their motivations related to us. My mom wants me to succeed.
Got it. Detailed profiles.
And critically, because these relationships are important and we think about them a lot, these representations of significant others are often chronically accessible. They're readily available in memory, just kind of waiting to be activated.
Like having your most called contacts right at the top of your mental phone book.
That's a good way to put it. Now, transference, in the social cognitive sense, Happens when you encounter a new person in your environment who, in some way, resembles one of these significant others.
Resembles how?
Physically. It could be physical resemblance, yeah.
Yeah.
Or it could be based on their personality attributes, their behavior, maybe even just the role they occupy relative to you. Like meeting a new boss who reminds you of a past mentor, or a new classmate who has the same quirky sense of humor as your sibling. The resemblance doesn't have to be perfect, or even something you consciously notice.
Okay, so the new person acts as a kind of cue.
Exactly. That resemblance, that cue, activates the stored mental representation of the significant other in your memory. And once that significant other representation is activated, the model suggests that you automatically, and often unconsciously, begin to interpret the new person and respond to them in ways that are consistent with your knowledge and experience of the original significant other.
Whoa, okay.
You might start attributing traits to the new person that are actually characteristics of the significant other, or you might have expectations about how this new person will behave based on how the significant other behaved in the past.
So if I meet someone new who, maybe in some subtle way, reminds me of a past friend who's always letting me down, I might automatically, without realizing it, expect this new person to also be unreliable, even if they haven't done anything to suggest that.
That's exactly the kind of inference and expectation bias the model predicts. And the research paradigm used to study this, really pioneered by Anderson and her team, is quite clever in demonstrating it.
How do they study it?
Typically, in a first session, they have participants identify several significant others in their lives and provide detailed descriptions of those individuals. And, crucially, they also have them describe themselves specifically as they are when interacting with each of those significant others that captures the content of the relational self.
Okay, baseline data.
Exactly. Then, maybe weeks or even months later, in what seems like a totally unrelated study, participants are told they'll interact with a new person. This new person is described to them using a short list of attributes. Now, here's the key manipulation. For some participants, let's call it the own S condition. These descriptive attributes are actually some of the very attributes the participant themselves had used to describe one of their own significant others back in session 1.
Ah, okay. So it's designed to subtly activate their specific representation of their own significant other.
Precisely. For other participants, in a control condition, the attributes used might be from someone else's description of their significant other, so it doesn't match the participant's own SO representation.
Got it.
Then, after being exposed to these descriptions of the new person, participants complete various tasks. These might measure their inferences about this new person, how they evaluate them, and really importantly, aspects of their own self-concept in that moment.
And what do they find?
Across numerous studies using this kind of design, they consistently find that participants in that own so condition, where the new person's description subtly cued their specific significant other, they make inferences and evaluations about the new person that are clearly biased towards their knowledge of the significant other.
Like seeing things that aren't there.
Yeah, they might recognize traits in the new person that weren't actually presented, but were true of their significant other. They might evaluate the new person more positively if the cued significant other was positive, and more negatively if the cued SO was negative. It clearly shows transference happening. The past relationship is coloring their perception of the new person.
Okay, that makes sense for how the significant other representation gets activated and influences how we see the new person.
Yeah.
But how does this loop back to the relational self? That's our main focus here.
Right. This is where the integration is so important. Anderson and Chen proposed back in 2002 that when the significant other representation is activated, triggered by resemblance to a new person, that activation doesn't just stop there. It spreads through those associative links in memory to the specific relational self that is stored and linked to that particular significant other.
So activating the my mentor representation automatically activates the self when I'm with my mentor, relational self that's connected to it in memory.
Exactly. The Me with Mentor folder gets opened, if you will. And the contents of that folder, how you typically see yourself, feel what your goals are, how you regulate yourself, and how you behave with that mentor, temporarily become part of your working self-concept. And this activated relational self then influences your thoughts, feelings, goals, self-regulatory strategies, and observable behaviors in the interaction with the new person who reminded you of the significant other in the first place.
Wow, that's quite a chain reaction. So the new person reminds me of someone from my past that activates my memory of that past person, which in turn activates the specific version of me that exists in that past relationship.
Yeah.
And that version of me influences how I think, feel, and act towards this new person right now.
That's precisely the mechanism they propose. Transference in this social cognitive model isn't just about misjudging the other person. It's the process that pulls that specific relationship-linked version of yourself off the memory shelf, making it active and influencing how you navigate this new, seemingly unrelated interaction.
That explains why these different relational selves can kind of pop up and influence us in sometimes surprising ways when we meet people who just happen to remind us of someone important from our past.
Exactly. It's a powerful mechanism.
That's really fascinating. It suggests this deep and often unconscious influence of our entire relational history on our current social interactions.
Yeah.
What kind of evidence do the authors point to in the research to back this up? To show that the relational self really is activated in transference and influences us in these specific ways.
Oh, the chapter details quite a bit of evidence across various domains of psychological functioning. Let's start with self-definition and self-evaluation.
Okay. How does transference affect how we see ourselves?
Well, studies consistently show that when a new person resembles a significant other, people's working self-concept does indeed shift towards the relational self associated with that significant other. Remember those Hinckley and Anderson studies from '96?
Vaguely, yes.
After participants were exposed to a new person described with attributes of their significant other, they were asked to describe and evaluate themselves. They found that participants described and evaluated themselves using features that significantly overlapped with how they had previously described their relational self for that specific significant other.
So if someone saw themselves as particularly, say, witty when they were with their funny best friend and they meet someone new who reminds them of that friend, they might, in that moment, be more likely to describe themselves as witty, even if that's not a trait they'd always claimed globally.
Exactly right. And what's more, the evaluation of these overlapping self-features matched the evaluation of the significant other. If the significant other was generally seen positively, the features of the relational self that became active were evaluated positively by the participant. If the significant other was negative, those activated features were evaluated negatively.
So it's not just the description, but the feeling associated with that relational self that comes forward. That links it directly to self-esteem, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. And building on this, Horberg and Chen's research in 2010 added another layer with this idea of self-worth staking.
Self-worth staking.
Yeah. They found that simply activating a significant other representation could lead people to base their momentary self-worth on domains they believed that significant other highly valued. But crucially, this effect was strongest only if the person desired closeness with that significant other.
Okay.
So, when that relational self was activated, success or failure in those domains the significant other cared about had a much bigger impact on their immediate feelings of self-esteem.
Right. Let's think about the classroom impact there. That's potentially huge. Imagine a student whose relational self with a parent who is very focused on academics, includes feeling maybe a bit inadequate in science, because that parent is often critical of their science grades.
Okay.
Now, if that student interacts with a teacher who somehow reminds them of that parent, maybe the teacher has a similar way of speaking, or also emphasizes getting the details exactly right like the parent does, that self with critical parent relational self could get activated.
Right, through transference.
And this activation, possibly combined with the student's underlying desire for that parent's approval, could lead them to stake their self-worth heavily on their science performance in that moment with that teacher. A small mistake on a science worksheet could then trigger a disproportionately large drop in their self-esteem right then and there, because that critical relational self is active.
That's a powerful and probably very common application. It really shows how these past relationship dynamics can make a student feel particularly vulnerable or defensive in specific academic areas, triggered just by relational cues from the teacher.
It really does. What about expectations in new interactions? Does transference shape what we expect from others?
Yes, this is another really well-documented finding. When interacting with a new person who resembles a significant other, people tend to project the expectations they hold in their relationship with that specific significant other onto the new person.
So you expect the new person to act like the old one?
Essentially, yes. Anderson, Resnick, and Manzella found this back in '96, and Berenson and Anderson further explored it. For instance, in a study involving participants who had experienced abusive relationships with parents, just expecting to interact with someone described with some attributes of that abusive parent led them to anticipate more rejection from that new person compared to control groups.
Wow. That expectation effect feels incredibly important for shaping how new relationships get started, especially in a school setting. A child who has had, say, difficult or rejecting relationships with peers in the past, maybe they were bullied or felt excluded,
Mm.
might, through transference activated by a new classmate who reminds them of a past bully,
Hmm.
maybe they look similar or talk in a similar way, automatically expect rejection from this new classmate, even if that new kid is actually trying to be friendly.
Exactly. That pre-existing expectation, derived entirely from the activated relational self, can significantly color the new interaction before it even really gets going.
Which I imagine leads us into goals and motives. How do these expectations in the activated relational self influence what we actually want or try to do in those new interactions?
They have a really significant impact there, too. Think about fundamental social motives, like the need to belong that Baumeister and Leary talked about. These are deeply tied to our significant
Makes
relationships.
sense.
So, studies show that when a new person resembles a positive significant other, people become more motivated to be emotionally open, more affiliative, less distant with them. They start pursuing closeness because that's the motive associated with the positive relational self that just got activated.
So you're basically more likely to try and connect with someone new if they unconsciously remind you of someone you felt good and connected with in the past,
Precisely. And the authors also bring in self-verification theory here, Swan's work,
which is about.
which is about our general desire to have others see us as we see ourselves, to confirm our self-views. Now, when transference activates a specific relational self, it also activates the motive to seek verification for the relational self-views contained within that specific self.
Okay.
And this is where it gets interesting, maybe even a bit counterintuitive. People show a preference for feedback from the new person that verifies their activated relational self-views, even if those views are negative.
Wait, even if they're negative, why would we want someone to confirm a negative view of ourselves?
It seems to be about maintaining a sense of prediction and coherence. When that specific relational self is active, feedback consistent with it, even if negative, feels right or predictable in that context. It confirms the reality of that activated self. So if myself with my teasing older brother relational self includes seeing myself as easily flustered, and that self is activated by a new coworker who reminds me of my brother, I might actually prefer or pay more attention to feedback from this coworker that confirms I seem flustered, rather than feedback saying I seem calm and collected, because the flustered feedback fits the currently active relational self-view.
That's fascinating and a bit unsettling. It's like we're trying to keep the world consistent with whichever self is currently running the show.
In a way, yes. And other research further shows the power of significant others on our goals. Fitzsimons and Barg found that just subliminally priming participants with a significant other's name could lead them to behave in ways consistent with goals associated with that SO.
Just the name.
Yeah. And more directly, Shaw's work showed that activating the significant other representation increases the accessibility, commitment, and even persistence for goals associated with that significant other, especially if the SO valued that goal and the relationship was close.
So thinking about my success-oriented parent makes me work harder on my goals.
It can, yes. And Shaw also found that the significant other's expectations about your ability to achieve a goal can even influence your own perception of how difficult that goal actually is.
The influence is just incredibly pervasive, isn't it?
Okay.
Classroom example time. A student might show way more persistence on a really challenging science project if the teacher happens to remind them of a parent who strongly values academic effort and achievement.
Right.
The relational self linked to that parent, which includes the goal of trying hard, maybe the belief that effort pays off, based on the parent's expectations, gets activated by the teacher resemblance.
Makes perfect sense.
Or conversely, maybe a student who sees themselves as the class clown within their self with certain peers, relational self, might unconsciously seek out feedback from a new group that confirms this view. Maybe by making distracting jokes and seeing who laughs, thereby verifying that specific, maybe not entirely positive, relational self-view.
Excellent examples. They really highlight how these goals and motives embedded within the relational self can drive behavior in new settings through transference.
Okay, what about the emotional side? That's such a huge part of any relationship. How does affect or feeling play into this transference dynamic?
Well, the emotions typically associated with the significant other relationship are often elicited when that relational self gets activated in transference. That's a key finding from Anderson and colleagues back in '96.
So the feeling state itself gets transferred.
Often, yes. In studies, participants showed more pleasant facial affect. They looked happier when interacting with a new person who resembled a positively evaluated significant other, mirroring the positive feelings associated with that original relationship.
Okay, that seems straightforward. Positive SO, positive feelings transfer.
Right. But it's not just about eliciting feelings. Affect can also be disrupted. Baum and Anderson found something interesting in '99. They discovered that negative affect could actually be elicited when a positively regarded significant other's representation was activated, if the new person's role was incongruent with the significant other's typical role.
Wait, activating a positive SO representation leads to negative feelings. How does that work?
Their example was something like, if a positive parent representation, who's typically seen as an authority figure, was activated by a new person described as a novice or someone needing help.
Why would that cause negative feelings?
The idea is that this incongruity creates a mismatch. The activated relational self is primed for a certain kind of interaction based on the significant other's usual role, like seeking guidance from the authoritative parent. But the reality of the new person's role, a novice who can't provide guidance, clashes with that. It signals that the goals or expectations you typically have in that positive relationship might not be met in this new interaction, leading to confusion, maybe frustration, or other negative feelings.
Okay, classroom example. A student might feel generally positive, safe, maybe more open when interacting with a new peer who reminds them of a really trusted friend from their neighborhood. That positive emotional state from their self with trusted friend, relational self, gets activated. But then, if that new peer suddenly acts in a way that's totally contrary to how the trusted friend behaves, maybe they become unexpectedly mean or really competitive in a game, it could cause confusion, distress, maybe even anger.
Because there's a mismatch?
Yeah. The student's activated relational self, primed for warmth and cooperation based on the friend, encounters behavior from the new peer that violates those expectations. It disrupts the expected positive dynamic and flips the switch to negative effect.
That's a powerful illustration of how our emotional compass can be set by these past relationships, and how deviations from that expected pattern in new interactions can be really effectively jarring.
Definitely. So how do we manage ourselves when a relational self is activated? What about self-regulation? That seems crucial.
It is, and it's another rich area the research explores. One key aspect is the effort to meet significant other-related standards. This ties into Higgins' self-discrepancy theory from '87.
Remind me of that one.
It posits we have different self-guides. The actual self, who we think we are, the ideal self, who we wish we were, and the ought self, who we feel we have a duty or obligation to be.
Okay.
And these guides can be based on our own perspective or, critically, on the perceived perspectives of significant others. Transference activates these specific, significant other-based ideal or ought self-guides that are part of the relational self.
So my ought self, according to my demanding boss, gets activated when I meet someone who reminds me of him.
Potentially, yes. And Resnick and Anderson found in 2007 that discrepancies between your actual self in that moment and these activated standards from the significant other lead to specific negative emotional states. You feel dejection-related emotions like sadness, disappointment if you fall short of an activated ideal standard. And you feel agitation-related emotions like anxiety, guilt, restlessness if you fall short of an activated ought standard.
Ah, okay. Ideal failure leads to sadness, ought failure leads to anxiety.
Roughly, yes. And this also connects to regulatory focus theory. Falling short of ideals tends to activate a promotion focus, motivated to approach positive outcomes, achieve gains, while falling short of oughts tends to activate a prevention focus, motivated to avoid negative outcomes, prevent losses.
So let's say a teacher reminds me of a parent whose super high academic ought standards I always felt I couldn't meet. If I'm in a situation like maybe giving a presentation in that teacher's class, that triggers that relational self. I might feel that same anxiety and agitation, that prevention focus, associated with failing to meet that parent's standard, even if this teacher has never explicitly set that standard for me.
That's precisely the proposed mechanism. The relational self carries those internalized standards and the emotional consequences of not meeting them. Their activation through transference brings the whole package, the standard, the emotion, the motivational focus into the present situation, driving you to avoid failure according to that specific past-derived ought standard.
That's huge. And you mentioned another form of self-regulation too, strategic responses.
Yes, strategic responses, which often function either to protect the self or to protect the relationship. When a negative relational self is activated, for example, if the self with critical sibling gets triggered and you feel incompetent, people might defensively shift their focus. Hinckley and Anderson found they might start favorably evaluating non-relational aspects of their working self-concept.
Like suddenly thinking, well, maybe I'm not great at this task, but I'm a really good cook, to kind of buffer their overall self-esteem.
Exactly. It's a way to protect the global self when a specific, negatively toned relational self is making you feel bad. And then there are also relationship protective strategies, particularly when a positive relational self is activated. Remember that facial affect study?
Yeah, where people looked happier with someone who reminded them of a positive SO.
Right. Well, Anderson and Baum found that when participants heard negative information about a new person resembling a positive significant other, they actually showed more pleasant facial effect.
More pleasant effect when hearing bad things. That seems weird.
It does seem counterintuitive, but it's interpreted as a way of buffering against the negative information. It's like they're trying to protect their positive view of the significant other, and by extension, the positive relational self tied to that SO, from being tainted by this negative info about the new person who resembles them. It's similar to the buffering effects Murray and Holmes described in close relationships, downplaying threats to maintain positive views.
Okay, classroom example time again. If a student really struggles with a writing assignment, and this activates a relational self tied to a parent who is maybe overly critical of their writing skills, leading to feelings of inadequacy. They might then try to emphasize how helpful they are to their classmates during group work, or how creative they are in art, focusing on strengths unrelated to that negative writing-related relational self. That's self-protective.
Good example.
And 4, relationship protective. If a teacher they really admire makes a small mistake, or maybe receives some mild criticism from another adult that the student overhears, the student might quickly jump to defend the teacher, downplay the mistake, or just visibly show their continued positive regard. They're protecting their positive view of the teacher and, implicitly, their positive self with admired teacher relational self.
Excellent illustrations of both types of strategic self-regulation in action when relational selves are active. And finally, of course, all of the self-views, expectations, goals, emotions, regulation culminates in observable interpersonal behavior.
Right. How we actually act towards the new person.
Exactly. That self-fulfilling prophecy dynamic we touched on earlier is a key behavioral outcome here. Burke and Anderson and Snyder, Tank, and Burscheid before them showed how this works. Your expectations about acceptance or rejection derived from the activated relational self influence your behavior towards the new person.
And
then your behavior can actually elicit responses from the new person that confirm your initial expectation. If you expect rejection, because you've activated a negative relational self, you might act withdrawn, or maybe even a bit defensive or hostile.
which makes the new person react negatively.
Exactly, which makes the new person respond coolly or negatively in return, thus confirming your initial relationally derived and possibly inaccurate expectation.
So the student expecting rejection from a new peer acts defensively, the new peer feels put off and responds coolly, and the student thinks, see, I knew they wouldn't like me. It's a tragic cycle driven by the activated past relationship.
It really highlights the power of these internal dynamics to shape external reality. And beyond that, affiliative behavior is also influenced. Krauss, Chen, and colleagues found in 2010 that people spontaneously show more affiliative behaviors, including things like choosing to sit physically closer with new people who resemble positive significant others. They're mirroring the behavior they typically have in those original positive relationships.
That's amazing. Even something as subtle as physical proximity is shaped by transference from past relationships.
It seems so. So to kind of wrap up this substantial section, the concept of transference provides the core engine, the mechanism through which these relationship-specific selves get activated, not just in the original relationship context, but powerfully and often unconsciously in our interactions with new people who simply bear some resemblance to significant others from our past.
And the evidence is broad.
It really is. The wealth of evidence demonstrates that this activation influences a huge spectrum of psychological processes, how we define and evaluate ourselves, our expectations of others, our goals and motivations, our emotional states, our self-regulation strategies, and ultimately our observable interpersonal behavior.
Wow. Okay, that is truly a deep dive into the engine driving the relational self. It's complex, no doubt, but incredibly insightful once you see all those connections. So the authors clearly build their model heavily on this transference research, but they also position it within the broader landscape of identity theory, right? By comparing and contrasting it with other significant perspectives.
Yes, they do. They explicitly discuss the points where their view overlaps with and where it differs from several other related concepts in the field. It helps situate their specific contribution.
Okay, let's explore that. How does their view relate to some of these other major theories? Where does it fit in?
Well, the first one they compare it to is relational schemas, a framework developed by Baldwin and his colleagues.
Relational schemas. How does that connect to the relational self?
There's actually a lot of convergence. The relational schema framework shares several fundamental ideas with the transference-based relational self-view. It also suggests that we store distinct knowledge about ourselves and significant others, that this knowledge is linked in memory, and that these linked structures, the schemas, can be activated transiently by cues or become chronically accessible over time.
So, similar basic architecture.
Very similar. The part of relational schemas that focuses on the self in relation to a specific other fits very nicely with the concept of the relational self. And the idea of interpersonal scripts within relational schemas, which are essentially if-then rules based on repeated interactions, also aligns really well with the idea of the specific linkages stored in memory that define the relational self.
Can you give an example of an if-then script?
Sure, like if I share something personal, then my friend will listen empathetically. Or, on the flip side, maybe if I ask for help, then my boss will think I'm incompetent. These kinds of learned rules that guide our expectations and behavior in specific relational contexts. And the relational schema perspective adds some valuable precision by really detailing how this relational self-knowledge likely gets formed through these repeated patterns of interaction and their outcomes, which eventually solidify into these if-then self-inference rules. This framework also suggests that relational schemas can be activated by a wider range of cues, including more abstract ones, not just direct resemblance to a significant other.
So, this framework seems highly applicable to understanding how a student's relational self with a specific teacher gets built up over time in the classroom.
Absolutely.
If a student repeatedly experiences the contingency, if I take a risk and answer a tough question, the teacher praises my effort. That builds a positive if-then rule and contributes to a more confident relational self with that teacher.
Exactly.
But if the contingency they learn is if I make a mistake, the teacher sighs or looks impatient, that builds a negative rule that's going to influence their future participation and contribute to a more hesitant, maybe anxious relational self in that class.
Precisely. And it really underscores the potential, maybe even the responsibility for teachers to be mindful and actively try to establish positive if-then contingencies to foster healthier relational schemas and thus healthier relational selves in their students.
That's a very practical insight stemming from how these theories overlap. Okay, what's the next comparison they make?
They also compare their view to attachment theory.
Another giant in developmental psychology and beyond. How does that fit in?
Well, attachment theory, starting with Bowlby's work on child-caregiver bonds and later extended to adult romantic relationships by people like Hazan and Shaver, focuses on how we develop these internal working models of self and others based on our early significant relationships.
Right. Secure, anxious, avoidant styles.
Exactly. It converges with the relational self-view in several ways. It applies to broad significant others, not just parents. It posits these complementary models of self, like, am I worthy of care? And are others responsive and trustworthy? And it involves both transient activation, like when feeling threatened, as Mickey Lintzer's work shows, and chronic accessibility of these models.
But attachment theory often seems focused on describing more general, enduring individual differences, right? Like your overall attachment style.
That's one key point where the focus differs. While more recent attachment research does acknowledge the existence of relationship-specific attachment models, attachment theory has traditionally emphasized these more global individual differences in attachment style. The relational self model, while acknowledging that general styles likely play a role, is more centrally focused on the specific self you are in relation to a particular person or type of person.
So less about my overall security, more about how secure I feel specifically with this person.
Exactly. However, attachment theory does make unique contributions. Particularly the idea that the attachment system itself is activated specifically in situations of threat or distress, leading to predictable behaviors aimed at seeking proximity or support, if secure, or other defensive strategies if insecure. It also contributes the idea of different levels of specificity for these working models, general versus relationship-specific.
Okay, thinking about the classroom again. A child's general attachment style can definitely influence their initial interactions and comfort level with teachers and peers.
Hmm.
A child with a generally secure attachment might be more trusting, more willing to explore, using the teacher as a secure base.
Right.
Whereas a child with anxious attachment might seem clingy or need constant reassurance, and one with an avoidance style might keep their distance.
Common patterns.
But the relational self-perspective, informed by attachment, suggests something hopeful. Even if a child has a generally insecure attachment style from home, developing a specific secure attachment with a supportive teacher could potentially create a secure base at school.
Yes, that's a key implication.
It could potentially buffer some of the negative effects of their general insecurity, at least within that school context.
Hmm.
And also, threatening situations in the classroom like failing a test, having a conflict with a peer, even just a stressful transition, could be particularly likely to activate these attachment working models and influence how the student copes.
That's a critical application, recognizing both the influence of early attachment and the potential for new positive relationships at school to mitigate some of those effects by fostering more secure relational selves in the school environment.
What about theories on how we incorporate others into our sense of self? You mentioned that relationships within the self idea earlier.
Right. That brings us to the inclusion of others in the self iOS model, developed primarily by Aaron and his colleagues.
And this is a prime example of that relationships within the self viewpoint.
It really is. The core idea of iOS is that as relationships become closer and more interdependent, individuals literally start to incorporate the significant other's resources, perspectives, and even aspects of their identity into their own self-concept. It's framed as a process of self-expansion through assimilation.
How do they show this happens?
Evidence includes things like people treating a close partner's resources, like their time or money, almost as if they were their own, showing a reduced actor-observer bias when explaining their partner's behavior, meaning they explain the partner's actions more like they explain their own, and even mistakenly attributing traits of the significant other to themselves in memory tasks.
That seems fundamentally different from the relational self model we've been discussing.
It is a clear point of divergence. While the relational self emphasizes that self and significant other knowledge are linked but remain distinct, reflecting a kind of complementary dynamic like you are submissive because they are dominant in that interaction. iOS focuses more on a merging or assimilation process. The boundary between self and other becomes blurred. It's also generally less focused on the contextual variation of the self. iOS measures usually assess how much the other is included in your general global self-concept.
So iOS might explain why very close friends sometimes start talking alike, or dressing similarly, or finishing each other's sentences. They've genuinely incorporated aspects of the other into their own identity structure.
That could be part of it, yes.
But it doesn't directly explain the specific dynamic that plays out between them in their interactions, or why meeting someone new who reminds me of friend A might activate a specific way of being that's unique to my relationship with friend B via transference.
Exactly. The authors acknowledge, though, that these views might not be entirely mutually exclusive. It's possible both things happen to some extent. You might incorporate some aspects of a significant other into your global self and still have a distinct self that emerges specifically in relation to them. Perhaps the degree of IOs, how much you include the other in yourself, influences how much the content of your various relational selves gets integrated into your broader, more context-free self-concept over time.
That makes sense. Both could be true. Okay, what's the final comparison they draw?
The last perspective they discuss is the Relational Interdependent Self-Control, RISC, which is primarily associated with the work of Susan Cross and her colleagues. And this is presented mainly as an individual difference variable.
Okay, so not a state that changes with context, but more like a stable trait.
Exactly. RISC captures the degree to which an individual globally defines themselves in terms of their close relationships. It's another example of a relationships within self view, but framed as a relatively stable personal characteristic. People who score high on RISC tend to see their relationships as really central to their overall identity structure.
So how does this global trait relate to the more context-specific relational self we've been focusing on?
Well, they operate at different levels of analysis, really. RISC
Okay.
describes a general orientation or trait, how much you tend to define yourself through relationships overall. The relational self model describes the lower order, context-specific schemas, the actual content, and the dynamic of the self as it appears with specific individuals or types of people.
So knowing someone is high in RASC doesn't tell me what their specific relational self with their mother looks like.
Exactly, nor does it explain the mechanism, like transference, by which those specific selves get activated in different contexts.
But maybe someone high in RASC would experience these relational dynamics more intensely
Yeah.
or be more affected by them.
That seems plausible, and it's one way the two concepts might relate. People high in RASC might simply have their various relational schemas, their specific relational selves, be more chronically accessible and therefore more influential across a wider range of situations. The research cited by the authors suggests this might be the case. For instance, Gabriel, Renaud, and Tippin found that activating a significant other representation boosted self-confidence, particularly for high RISC individuals, suggesting their self-system is just more readily influenced by relational cues.
Okay, classroom relevance again. Understanding RISC could be really helpful for identifying students who might be particularly sensitive to and influenced by peer dynamics and group acceptance.
Definitely.
For students high in RISC, social inclusion and positive peer relationships might be especially critical motivators and influences on their behavior and well-being in the classroom. A teacher might need to be more mindful of how group work is structured, how social conflicts are handled, or how peer support is used for these students. And high RISC students might benefit more from strategies that connect learning directly to relationships, like collaborative projects or study groups, because their goals are often naturally aligned with relational outcomes.
It adds that important layer of understanding individual variation in how central these relational dynamics are for different people.
Okay, so we've explored the core definition, the engine of transference, and how this whole relational self idea fits within the broader landscape of identity theories. Before we wrap up, what are some of the broader connections the authors touch on? And what future directions do they highlight in the research?
Yeah, they connect the relational self idea to some really important broader concepts like cultural identity and gender, and they also point to some exciting avenues for future research, many of which have clear implications for understanding social dynamics, including in educational settings.
Okay, how does culture intersect with the relational self? That seems like a big one.
It is. They discuss the well-known distinction between independent and interdependent self-controls, famously highlighted by Marcus and Kitayama, and also explored by people like Brewer and Chen.
Independent being more common in Western cultures, interdependent in East Asian cultures.
Generally speaking, yes. The independent self emphasizes individuality, autonomy, uniqueness. The interdependent self emphasizes connectedness, social roles, fitting in, maintaining harmony within relationships and groups. Now, an interdependent self might sound similar to the relational self, but the authors point out it's broader.
Daughter, how?
It includes group memberships and collective identities, not just specific dyadic relationships. And it's tied to distinct cultural tasks or goals. For example, prioritizing adjustment to others and situational demands might be highly valued in Japan, whereas emphasizing self-focused adjustment and expressing your unique self might be more valued in North America.
So, while people everywhere probably adjust themselves to different relationships to some extent, the degree to which they see this as central to their identity and the specific reasons or goals behind that adjustment, like maintaining group harmony versus expressing a distinct self, might differ across cultures.
Precisely. And the authors cite research by English and Chen from 2007 showing cultural differences in the consistency of the self across different relationship contexts.
Consistency across contexts.
Yeah. They found that East Asian Americans, compared to European Americans, showed less consistency in how they rated their personality attributes when thinking about themselves with different significant others, like comparing me with mom to me with my best friend.
Interesting. What does that suggest?
It suggests that for individuals from more interdependent cultural backgrounds, their relational selves might be more distinct or differentiated from each other. Their me with mom folder might have very different contents from their me with best friend folder, with maybe less overlap than for someone from a more independent cultural background.
So more distinct selves for different relationships.
That's the interpretation. However, it's crucial to note that both groups showed similarly high levels of consistency within the same context over time. So while an East Asian American might seem less consistent across different relationships than a European American, they would still be quite consistent within their specific relationship with their mother over time.
Okay, that's an important nuance. It's about consistency across versus within contexts. What about gender? Are there differences there?
Yes, the authors discuss research, particularly from North American samples as noted by Cross and Madsen back in '97, which consistently shows gender differences on that relational interdependent self-control RISC measure we talked about.
And the finding is?
The consistent finding in these samples is that women tend to score higher on RISC than men.
Suggesting women, on average in these cultures, are more likely to define themselves in terms of their relationships.
That's the general finding, yes. And this has several implications that connect back to the relational self. For instance, remember that finding that activating relational selves might boost self-confidence more for high RISC individuals?
Yeah.
Well, given that women tend to score higher on RISC, this suggests activating relational selves might have a greater impact on women's overall self-confidence compared to men's on average. Also, Chen, English, and Peng found in 2006 that women were more likely than men to seek verification specifically for their relational self-views.
Meaning they were more driven to have others see them as they see themselves within a specific relationship context.
Exactly, rather than just seeking verification for more global self-views.
Okay, classroom relevance again. This suggests that while social dynamics are important for everyone, gender might influence just how central they are to a student's identity, on average. Understanding that female students, again on average in these cultural contexts, might have identities more strongly linked to relationships could inform how teachers approach things like group work, resolving peer conflicts, or even giving individual feedback.
Right.
Validating the relational aspects of identity and providing opportunities for positive relational experiences might be particularly impactful for female students' self-esteem and sense of belonging at school.
It's definitely something to consider. Now, moving to future directions, the authors highlight several really interesting avenues for further research based on this relational self model. One is exploring moderators of transference effects.
Moderators, meaning factors that make transference stronger or weaker.
Exactly. What factors make these effects where a new person reminds you of an old significant other and activates that relational self more or less likely to happen, or more or less intense when they do happen?
Okay, what kind of factors might moderate it?
Well, they mentioned things related to an individual's state, like circadian mismatch, basically, being tired. Research suggests tired brains tend to rely more heavily on accessible schemas, which could include significant other representations, making transference more likely when you're fatigued.
Interesting.
Similarly, having a high need for cognitive closure, that's the desire for firm, clear answers, wanting to avoid ambiguity, can lead people to seize onto accessible knowledge structures, like SO representations and their linked relational selves, when encountering new, ambiguous individuals. They want to figure the new person out quickly, and the old pattern provides a ready-made answer.
So maybe a student who is really tired or feeling particularly anxious and wanting certainty, perhaps before a big test, might be more susceptible to reacting to a new substitute teacher or a new classmate based purely on past relationship dynamics triggered by transference.
That's the potential implication, yes. These findings add important nuance about the conditions under which these relational dynamics are most likely to powerfully shape new interactions. Other moderators they mention include whether the new person's goals seem to align with the significant other's goals for you, and individual differences in motivation to respond to social cues like self-monitoring, how much you adapt your behavior to the situation, or just your general need to belong. These can all influence how much you rely on or are influenced by the activated relational self.
Okay, that makes sense. What's another future direction they point to?
Relational selves and social identity. This is fascinating. The research shows that information about a significant other's group memberships, like their ethnic identity, political affiliation, things like that, can actually be stored as part of the significant other representation and potentially even within the linked relational self. And this group identity information can be activated in transference, too. Well, Sarah Bay and Anderson found, for instance, that people assumed a new person resembling a significant other actually shared that significant other's ethnic identity. And interestingly, bias against other social groups was influenced by the perceived diversity of the significant other's social network.
Wow. So our personal relationship dynamics can connect to these broader social perceptions and even potential biases towards whole groups.
It suggests that our experiences with specific, significant others can shape how we perceive and react to individuals from different social groups, especially if those individuals happen to remind us of our significant others. But encouragingly, this also opens up possibilities for using the power of positive relational experiences to improve intergroup relations.
Wow.
Research by people like Michelin and Shaver, and also Krauss and colleagues, suggests that activating positive significant other representations can lead people to evaluate outgroup members more positively. In transference studies, people evaluated a new target person positively if they resembled a positive significant other, even if that target person was from a different social group than the participant.
That's a really powerful and hopeful implication. Positive relational experiences and activating those positive relational selves could actually be a subtle tool to help reduce prejudice and improve interactions across group lines.
It's a promising avenue. Finally, and perhaps most relevant for our discussion about well-being and education, the authors delve into the potential for relational selves to serve as self-affirmational resources.
Self-affirmation. Remind me what that is again.
Self-affirmation theory from Claude Steele back in '88 basically proposes that when our self-worth is threatened in one area, say you perform poorly on an important task,
Okay.
we can buffer against that threat and protect our overall sense of self-esteem by affirming another important aspect of ourself, ideally one that's unrelated to the threat domain. Like reminding yourself that even though you messed up that presentation, you're a really kind and supportive friend, or you're great at playing the guitar.
Right. Emphasizing a strength when you feel weak in another area.
Exactly. And Chen and Boucher, among others, have argued and found evidence that a positive relational self can serve precisely this self-affirmational function.
How does that work?
When your self-worth is threatened in a non-relational domain like academic failure, getting negative feedback at work, activating an important positive relational self, can buffer against the negative impact of that threat on your overall self-esteem.
Like thinking about.
Like thinking about the self you are with a really supportive family member who makes you feel unconditionally loved and capable. Bringing that relational self to mind can help protect your self-worth from the hit it took due to the academic failure.
That seems incredibly useful.
It really is. And this seems especially effective for individuals who tend to value relationships highly, like women or those high in RISC, as we discussed. But the research suggests it can benefit others, too, if they are prompted or reminded to affirm a valued relational aspect of themselves. It can actually help repair damaged self-esteem after a psychological blow.
This feels like a crucial, really actionable takeaway for educators.
Absolutely. Understanding this mechanism provides a direct pathway for supporting student well-being in the classroom. Teachers can actively encourage students to identify and reflect on the positive relationships in their lives with supportive peers, family members, mentors, coaches, maybe even other teachers or staff members at school.
Just prompting them to think about it.
Yeah. Prompting them to think about who makes them feel capable, accepted, or valued can help activate those positive relational selves. And those activated selves can then serve as powerful internal resources when students face academic setbacks, social disappointments, or other challenges that inevitably threaten their self-worth.
And of course, explicitly fostering positive, supportive, student-teacher relationships.
Exactly. That directly creates a positive relational self for the student with that teacher, a self that can then serve this buffering, self-affirmational function right there within the school context itself.
So building strong connections with students isn't just about making the classroom run smoother or having good rapport. It's actually about contributing to a part of their identity that can literally protect their self-esteem and foster resilience when things get tough.
That's a fantastic way to put it. And beyond this specific self-affirmation function, just encouraging the activation of representations of positively evaluated significant others through simple reminders, reflections, maybe writing exercises can promote well-being more broadly.
How so?
Well, as we saw with all that transference evidence, activating these positive representations and their linked positive relational selves tends to lead to more positive self-evaluations, more positive expectations of others, and more positive behavioral responses towards others.
It's a remarkably simple but profound implication, isn't it? Intentionally bringing to mind the people who make you feel good about yourself can actually make you feel better about yourself and predispose you to interact more positively with the next person you meet.
It really highlights the therapeutic and positive potential that's inherent in our relational architecture. We just need to learn how to access it more consciously.
Okay, wow. We have covered a tremendous amount of ground today. We've gone from the basic definition of the relational self through the intricate engine of transference that activates it, compared it to other major theories, and explored its connections to culture, gender, and especially its powerful implications for well-being and resilience. This deep dive into the Chen, Boucher, and Krauss chapter really provides a complex but incredibly insightful view of identity as something dynamic and fundamentally relational.
It really does. It strongly underscores that who you are isn't just a set of static traits you carry around. It's much more fluid, much more context-dependent, profoundly shaped by your relationships with the significant people in your life, both past and present. It's not just your general personality, it's who you are, how you think, feel, want, and act when you are relating to specific individuals or categories of individuals.
And for you listening, especially with that background in elementary education and interest in psychology, this understanding of the relational self and these processes like transference offer some really profound insights into the dynamics you likely observe every single day. It helps explain why students might behave, feel, and see themselves so differently across contexts, why they might thrive in one group activity but completely withdraw in another, why they respond openly and confidently to one adult but seem fearful or hesitant with another. It underscores the powerful, often unconscious influence that their relationships, their relational history has on their identity and their emotional lives, right there within the school environment.
Yeah, it shifts the focus, doesn't it? From just identifying individual student problems to really considering the relational context as a crucial driver of a student's behavior, their emotions, and even their potential.
Absolutely. So here's a final thought for you to perhaps ponder as you consider the students you work with, and indeed your own experiences. Given how powerfully our significant relationships shape our sense of self and our interactions with others, how aware are you of the different relational selves you inhabit throughout your own day? And maybe even more importantly, what responsibility do we have as parents, as friends, as colleagues, or perhaps especially as educators in the classroom to consciously try to cultivate positive, supportive relational experiences? Experiences that can foster healthier, more positive relational selves in those around us, providing them with these internal resources for well-being and resilience. What might happen if we more intentionally focus on the relational dynamics we actively create?
That's definitely a question worth reflecting on.